The atmosphere at Mark's housewarming party was lively, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and cheerful conversations. His new Denver home was bright and modern, with an open floor plan that allowed guests to move freely between the kitchen, living room, and patio. The scent of catered appetizers and expensive wine lingered in the air, and everyone seemed to be in high spirits. Then, Mark raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced, his voice commanding attention. The chatter died down as the guests turned toward him, eager to hear what he had to say. His eyes gleamed with excitement, that familiar spark I'd seen countless times before, right before he was about to steal the spotlight. I had grown up witnessing Mark's talent for grand gestures, his ability to turn any gathering into a stage for himself. To new beginnings, new homes, and... He paused dramatically, glancing around the room, ensuring he had everyone's full attention before delivering the final part of his toast. To Grandpa's memory. A respectful silence fell over the room. The mention of Grandpa hit hard. He had passed away just 4 days ago, and the wound was still fresh for all of us. Losing him had felt like losing a piece of the foundation that held our family together. He had been our rock, wise, patient, and always full of warmth. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat and raised my glass along with the others, quietly honoring the man who had meant so much to me. As we took our sips, Mark set his drink down on the coffee table and cleared his throat. "Speaking of Grandpa," he continued, reaching into his pocket. My heart skipped a beat as he pulled out an envelope, slightly worn at the edges. A strange, uneasy feeling crept over me as I watched him. There was something in his expression, something subtle, almost calculated, that made me instinctively wary. "Before he passed, Grandpa gave me this letter," Mark said, his voice carrying through the room. "He wanted me to have his vacation home by the lake." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. My parents beamed with pride, my mother clasping her hands together in visible delight. Mark's girlfriend, Teresa, clapped excitedly, practically glowing with admiration. My cousin, Jenna, shot me a confused look from across the room. She knew, just as I did, how close I had been with Grandpa. She knew how much that lakeside cabin had meant to him, and to me. I sat there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what I had just heard. The cabin wasn't just any property. It was Grandpa's most cherished possession, a place filled with memories, a place where I had spent nearly every weekend for the past 3 years, helping him maintain it, listening to his stories, learning from him. Mark, on the other hand, had barely set foot there. Maybe twice in the last 5 years, and even then, he had complained about the lack of Wi-Fi and the boredom of being surrounded by nature. He never cared about the place, at least, not in the way I did. But more importantly, something didn't add up. 3 weeks ago, Grandpa had given me a small wooden box and made me promise not to open it until the time was right. Inside that box was a notarized deed transferring ownership of the vacation home to me. Grandpa had already given me the cabin. It wasn't even part of his estate anymore. As Mark unfolded the letter in his hands, preparing to read what were supposedly Grandpa's wishes, I studied his face carefully. Was he lying? Did he know about the deed? Had Grandpa somehow changed his mind without telling me? I forced a smile and managed to say, "That's great, Mark. Good for you." My voice was steady, but inside, I was reeling. I needed to get home. I needed to check the documents in that wooden box immediately. Excusing myself quietly, I told everyone I had to use the bathroom. But instead of heading down the hallway, I slipped toward the back of the house. As soon as I shut the door behind me, I leaned against it, taking a deep breath. Something wasn't right. And I was going to find out the truth. I left Mark's house with my heart pounding, slipping out the back door while everyone was still caught up in his announcement. My cousin Jenna had covered for me, texting me a simple, "Got it. Be careful," as I made my way to my car. The night air was crisp, but I barely noticed as I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The drive back to my apartment felt surreal. The city lights blurred past as my mind raced through everything that had just happened. Had Grandpa really changed his mind without telling me? The thought gnawed at me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was lying. He had never cared about the cabin before. He had always dismissed it as an old man's retreat and complained that there was nothing to do whenever he was forced to visit as a kid. So why would Grandpa, the man who had spent his final years teaching me how to care for that place, suddenly decide to give it to Mark? It didn't make sense. By the time I reached my apartment, I barely remembered the drive. I rushed inside, heading straight for my closet. My hands trembled as I pulled out the small wooden box that Grandpa had given me 3 weeks ago. It was his old cigar box, worn smooth with age, still carrying the faint scent of cedar and tobacco. "Don't open this until you need to know the truth," Grandpa had told me, his eyes crinkling with that knowing look of his. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were several documents. My fingers brushed over a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's unmistakable shaky handwriting, the result of his worsening arthritis. But my breath caught when I saw what lay beneath it. A notarized deed transferring ownership of the vacation home to me. It was dated 6 months ago. My heart pounded in my ears as I unfolded it, reading the words over and over again, making sure I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't just a promise. This was legal. Final. Grandpa had already given me the cabin. It wasn't part of his estate or will. It was mine. Tears stung my eyes as I picked up the letter addressed to me. I carefully unfolded it, my vision blurring as I took in the familiar scrawl. "My dearest Ariana, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. I've decided to give you the cabin while I'm still alive to avoid any complications. You're the only one who truly loved this place as much as I did. Your brother never showed interest, except when he needed a place to host parties when I wasn't around. I know he might contest this, which is why I've had everything properly notarized and filed. There's a copy with my lawyer, Harold Thompson. The cabin is legally yours already. This isn't part of my will or estate. I trust you to honor the spirit of our special place." A sob broke from my throat as I clutched the letter to my chest. Grandpa had known. He had seen this coming. He had made sure I wouldn't have to fight for something that was already mine. My phone buzzed, jolting me back to the present. It was Jenna. "You okay?" That was weird. Mark never even cared about the cabin. I quickly texted back, "Need to check something at home. Can you cover for me? Say I got called into work." Within minutes, she had made my excuses to the family. Another notification flashed across my screen, this time from Mark. "Nice disappearing act. Don't worry, you can still visit the cabin if you ask nicely." I stared at the message, my hands shaking. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. Mark had fabricated a letter, banking on the fact that no one would question him. He had used Grandpa's passing as an opportunity to stake a false claim on something that was never his. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Grandpa had already secured everything, protecting me from this very moment. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I wasn't going to confront him over text or phone. No. This called for something more direct. I carefully tucked the documents back into the wooden box, gripping it tightly. Then, I grabbed my keys and headed back to Mark's house. It was time for the truth to come out. As I pulled up to Mark's house, my heart pounded, but my mind was clear. I wasn't here to argue, I was here for the truth. The wooden box, containing Grandpa's notarized deed and letter, sat beside me, undeniable proof that Mark had lied. The party had died down, leaving only family behind. Perfect. I grabbed the box and walked to the door, knocking firmly. Mark answered, his face flashing with surprise. "Work emergency over already?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "We need to talk," I said, stepping past him. The living room was tense. My father was studying the letter Mark had shown earlier. My mother and Teresa were discussing cabin renovations. Jenna, sitting quietly, gave me a knowing look. "Ariana's back," my mother announced. "We were just talking about Mark's wonderful news." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss." I set the wooden box on the coffee table. Mark's face hardened. "What's that?" "Something Grandpa gave me 3 weeks ago," I said. "He told me not to open it until the time was right. I think that time is now." Curiosity flickered in my father's eyes. "What is it, Ariana?" I opened the box and pulled out the notarized deed. 6 months ago, Grandpa legally transferred ownership of the cabin to me. It's already mine. Silence fell. My mother's eyes widened. My father examined the document, his brow furrowing. Mark stood frozen. "This is notarized," my father confirmed. "This is Grandpa's signature." "That's impossible," Mark stammered. "Grandpa gave me the letter. He wanted me to have the cabin." "Let me see that letter again." My father handed it over, and I placed it beside Grandpa's real letter. The difference was stark. Mark's letter was too perfect, too controlled, lacking the telltale shakiness of Grandpa's arthritis. My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mark, did you forge this?" Mark clenched his jaw, then exhaled sharply. "You don't understand. It's not fair that she gets everything." "Everything?" I repeated, stunned. "You were always Grandpa's favorite," Mark snapped. "Always visiting, always helping, always the perfect grandchild. The rest of us barely got a look in." My father cleared his throat. "Mark, forging a letter is serious." My mother compared both letters, disappointment settling on her face. "Oh, Mark, how could you?" Teresa stood abruptly. "I think I should go." She avoided Mark's pleading gaze and walked out the door. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Jenna gave me a small, supportive nod. My father broke the silence. "Why would you claim the cabin without checking if it was true? The will isn't even read yet." Mark's face reddened. He shifted uneasily. "I found out about the deed," he muttered. I stiffened. "I was at Grandpa's lawyer's office last week, asking about the estate," he admitted. "Thompson mentioned that the cabin wasn't part of it. He wouldn't tell me more, but I knew. So I thought, if I announced it first, maybe." My mother's voice was firm. "Maybe what?" "Maybe Ariana would just let me have it. Maybe everyone would believe me instead of her for once." His words cut deeper than I expected. "Mark," I said, my voice softer, Grandpa invited you to the cabin so many times. You always said you were too busy. His frustration flared. Because I felt like an outsider. By the time I realized what I was missing, it was too late. You had your special bond. There was no room for me. My father shook his head. That doesn't justify lying to the family. Mark slumped into a chair, defeated. So what happens now? I took a deep breath. This isn't about winning. I reached into the wooden box and pulled out something else, an envelope with Mark's name written in Grandpa's handwriting. He left something for you too. Silence filled the room as I handed Mark the envelope. His fingers hesitated before taking it, his face unreadable. Slowly, he tore it open and scanned the contents. His expression shifted from shock to something resembling remorse. He knew, Mark muttered. He knew I might try to claim the cabin. What does it say? My mother asked gently. Mark hesitated, then handed her the letter. Read it. She adjusted her glasses and began. Dear Mark. I've known you since the day you were born. You always wanted recognition, things I may have failed to give you the way you needed. But I also know that when you feel overlooked, you act impulsively, sometimes her. The cabin belongs to Ariana, not because I loved you less, but because she cherished it the way I did. She understands its spirit, and I true. What you need isn't a property, it's a purpose. I've enclosed a $25,000 check. Use it to build something meaningful, maybe that business idea you mentioned. Ariana will always keep the door open for you, but your future lies in creating something of your own. With love. Grandpa. When she finished, the room was silent. Mark sat frozen, gripping the check tightly. His voice was barely a whisper. He saw right through me. My father placed a hand on his shoulder. He always did. Mark turned to me, something raw in his expression. I'm sorry, Ariana. I had no right to try and take what was already yours. I studied him, sensing his sincerity. There's something else, I said, reaching into the wooden box. I pulled out a small photo album, flipping through pictures of us as kids, building sandcastles, fishing, roasting marshmallows. He kept this in his desk, I murmured. He never stopped hoping you'd come around. Mark ran his fingers over the photos, his face filled with regret. I really messed up, didn't I? Yes, I admitted. But Grandpa believed in second chances. So do I. I took out a calendar. I've marked weekends when I'll be at the cabin. I could use an extra pair of hands. Mark looked at me in disbelief. Really? I nodded. The cabin was meant to bring family together, not divide us. For the first time in years, Mark smiled, small but real. Thank you, he whispered. For Grandpa's sake, I was willing to try. The night's events had shaken all of us, and though the truth was out, the weight of it still lingered. The family left in uneasy silence, each of them processing what had happened. Jenna hugged me before heading out, whispering, "Call me tomorrow." My parents exchanged worried glances as they said their goodbyes, torn between disappointment in Mark and concern for him. Once everyone was gone, it was just Mark and me, standing awkwardly in his now quiet house. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, years of resentment and misunderstanding hovering just beneath the surface. Mark moved to the kitchen, mechanically making coffee, though neither of us really wanted it. The tension sat thick between us. I didn't plan it, he said suddenly, setting a mug in front of me. The forgery, I mean. He stared into his cup. When I found out about the deed, I was angry. Hurt. I wrote the letter that same night. I didn't even think I'd use it. Then why did you? I asked, watching him carefully. Mark let out a breath. Because when I saw everyone here tonight, celebrating my new house, I wanted more. Something bigger. So, I just said it. He shook his head. I don't know what I was thinking. I studied him, seeing past the arrogance and bravado that had always defined him. You were jealous. His lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah, he admitted. Of what you had with Grandpa. Of the time you spent with him. I thought if I had the cabin, it would make up for all the time I missed. His voice faltered. But it wouldn't, would it? No, I said honestly. It wouldn't. He nodded, as if finally accepting it. I used the money, he said suddenly, lifting his eyes to meet mine. I frowned. What money? The check Grandpa left me, he clarified. I enrolled in that woodworking course he always told me to take. He let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. Turns out, I'm terrible at it. But I'm sticking with it. He hesitated before adding, he was right. It's calming, focusing on something with your hands. I felt a twinge of something, maybe hope. He would have liked that. For a while, we sat in silence, the same way Grandpa and I had so many times at the cabin. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. Finally, I stood. I should go. It's been a long night. Mark walked me to the door, hesitating before asking, what are you going to do with the cabin? I had been asking myself the same question since Grandpa had given me the deed 6 months ago. Keep it mostly as it is, I said. It needs repairs, but I don't want to change its character. Mark nodded, looking relieved. That's good. It should stay the way Grandpa loved it. I studied him, wondering if this moment would pass as just another temporary truce. But then I heard Grandpa's voice in my mind, reminding me that grudges only weigh the heart down. You're welcome there, you know, I said, watching his reaction. His eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. Even after what I did? The cabin was meant to bring family together, not drive us apart, I said simply. That doesn't mean I'm not still angry. Or that I trust you completely right now. But the door is open. Mark swallowed hard, as if trying to hold back emotion. Thank you, he said quietly. We stood there for a moment before I finally turned and walked to my car. As I drove home, the wooden box sat securely beside me. The weight of responsibility that Grandpa had left me was heavy, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a chance. A chance to heal. A chance to move forward. A chance to do what Grandpa had always wanted, bring the family back together. Next morning, I packed a small bag and set off for the cabin. The long drive through winding roads and towering pines was familiar, comforting even. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, dappling the road with golden light. As I approached the gravel driveway, a deep sense of calm settled over me. The cabin looked just as I remembered it, weathered cedar siding, emerald green shutters, and the wraparound porch where Grandpa used to sit in his rocking chair. It was more than a house. It was a sanctuary, a place filled with memories, laughter, and quiet conversations by the lake. For a moment, I sat in my car, taking it all in. This place was mine now. Not just a property, but a responsibility. Grandpa had entrusted it to me, and I intended to honor that. I stepped out, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The scent of pine and damp earth wrapped around me, instantly transporting me back to all the summers the first had spent here. As I approached the door, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key, the same key Grandpa had always used. The lock resisted at first, as it always had, until I jiggled it just right. Grandpa used to say it kept out the riffraff, and he'd refused to fix it no matter how many times I had offered. Inside, everything was exactly as he had left it. His books stacked neatly on the side table. His fishing gear arranged meticulously in the corner. The scent of pipe tobacco still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. I trailed my fingers along the wooden furniture, each piece holding a story. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a collection of moments, of late-night talks, of learning how to gut a fish, of quiet evenings staring at the stars. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. "Jenna, how's the cabin? Mom called me this morning. Mark is a wreck." I sighed, already knowing the fallout from last night would take time to settle. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired overnight. I texted back, "Cabin's perfect. Not sure how I feel about Mark yet." She responded almost instantly. "He's been calling everyone, trying to explain himself. Your parents are still pretty upset." I wasn't surprised. My parents had always given Mark the benefit of the doubt, but forging a letter to manipulate the family was something even they couldn't ignore. Setting my phone aside, I walked to the large picture window overlooking the lake. The water sparkled in the morning sun, calm and unchanging, indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded over the past 24 hours. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. "I'm here, Grandpa," I whispered. "I'll take care of it. I promise." The cabin felt different now. Before, it had been a place where I found comfort in Grandpa's presence. Now, it was a place where I would learn to stand on my own. 3 weeks passed before I heard from Mark. His text was simple: "Can we talk at the cabin?" I hesitated before responding. Part of me wasn't ready to share this space with him. But Grandpa's words echoed in my mind, "Holding grudges only makes the heart heavy." After a day of deliberation, I replied with a time and date. That Saturday, I sat on the porch swing, nursing a cup of coffee as Mark's car pulled into the driveway. He stepped out slowly, his usual confidence absent. "This place hasn't changed at all," he murmured, taking in the view. "That's the idea," I replied, nodding toward the chair across from me. He sat down, drumming his fingers against his knee. "I've been thinking about what to say for weeks, but everything sounds inadequate." "Try anyway," I suggested, my voice neither cold nor particularly warm. He took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. Not just for the forgery, but for everything, for being jealous, for resenting you instead of looking at my own choices." I studied him carefully. "Why did you do it, Mark?" "The truth." He exhaled, staring out at the lake. "I thought if I had the cabin, it would make up for all the time I didn't spend here. Like I could buy back those moments I missed." His voice cracked slightly. Stupid, right? For the first time, I saw something real in him. Not just guilt, but understanding. I shook my head. "Not stupid. Just misguided." He gave a small, sad chuckle. "I used the money," he said suddenly. "Grandpa's check." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "I enrolled in that woodworking course Grandpa always told me to take." The one I was too busy for. He smirked, though there was no arrogance in it this time. Turns out, I'm terrible at it. But I'm sticking with it. Something in my chest tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to hope. He would have liked that, I admitted. We sat in silence, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The same sound that had accompanied countless conversations between Grandpa and me. I have something to show you, I said finally. I led him inside to Grandpa's study, where the antique roll-top desk stood in the corner. I used the brass key to unlock it, revealing neatly organized compartments filled with letters, papers, and keepsakes. Mark frowned as I pulled out a folder labeled with his name. Inside were newspaper clippings of his high school debate championship, photos of his college graduation, even a printout of his promotion last year. He was proud of you, I said softly. He just showed it differently than you wanted. Mark's fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages. I had no idea. There's a folder for each of us, I added. He called it his brag book. Mark swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. I really messed up, didn't I? Yes, I said simply. But Grandpa believed in second chances. So do I. I pulled out a calendar and handed it to him. I've marked weekends when I'll be here. There's work to be done. I could use an extra pair of hands. Mark stared at it before glancing back at me. Really? I nodded. The cabin was meant to bring family together, not drive us apart. For the first time, Mark looked at the cabin not as something he had lost, but as something he still had a chance to be part of. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, he'd take that chance. That afternoon, Mark and I sat on the edge of the dock, our feet dangling over the cool water. The lake stretched before us, calm and endless, its surface rippling gently under the late afternoon sun. It was the same view Grandpa had cherished, the same place where we had once played as kids before life, distance, and resentment had pulled us apart. Mark skimmed a small rock across the surface, watching as it skipped 3 times before sinking. You know, he said, breaking the quiet, I think Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing when he gave you the cabin. I turned to him, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? He exhaled, shaking his head. You didn't just inherit a place, he said thoughtfully. You inherited his role. Keeping the family connected to what matters. His words caught me off guard. It was something I had felt deep down but hadn't yet put into words. Grandpa had done more than just leave me a house, he had entrusted me with something bigger, something intangible but just as important. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't awkward like it had been before. It felt lighter now, like something had shifted. So, Mark finally said, stretching his legs out in front of him, what's first on the repair list? I smirked. You volunteering? Hey, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender, I'm still terrible at woodworking, but I can hold a hammer. I laughed, shaking my head. The boathouse needs work. And the porch steps are a little wobbly. Mark nodded. Okay. I can help with that. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. Later that evening, as the sun dipped lower, we sat at the old picnic table near the cabin, a notebook open between us. We sketched out possible renovations, making lists of materials, deciding what should stay and what needed fixing. It wasn't just about repairs, it was about rebuilding something between us, too. You know, Mark said after a moment, I used to think the cabin was just some old place. Like, I didn't get why Grandpa cared so much. And now? I prompted. He glanced around, taking in the towering trees, the way the lake reflected the orange hues of the setting sun. He let out a small, almost sheepish chuckle. Now, I get it. That admission meant more to me than he probably realized. As the sky darkened, we made our way back to the porch. I grabbed an old photo album from inside, flipping through pages filled with summers past, campfires, fishing trips, lazy afternoons in the hammock. I passed it to Mark, watching as he studied the images. "Grandpa really kept all these?" he asked. I nodded. "He never stopped hoping you'd come around." Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I really messed up, didn't I?" "Yes," I said honestly. "But Grandpa believed in second chances. And if he did, I guess I can, too." Mark glanced at me, his expression unreadable for a moment before he gave a small nod. "I won't waste it." We sat in comfortable silence, the crickets chirping around us, the lake stretching dark and endless before us. The past couldn't be changed, but the future, our future as siblings, was still unwrit. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Grandpa had given me more than a cabin. He had given me a chance to heal old wounds, to bring our family back together. And I intended to honor that.